Hey guys, welcome to Sabbath School Boot Camp for this is quarter 2 of 2022. We are going to be talking about this quarterly this adult Bible study guide. Okay, we get it. We're just used to calling them quarterlies, at least I am. And this is on Genesis, so we are happy that you are joining us. This is my friend Jim Merrills. He lives in this place. It's north of Ohio. I can't say the name.
Had to mention Ohio. Go Blue.
Where are you from?
Michigan, born and raised. Go Blue!
Go Buckeyes!
Go home, Blue, I think is what you were trying to say. Oh, well, Jim is a jack of all trades. You have an MDiv from the seminary, is that correct?
Yeah.
Oh, that means you're an expert here, and you're going to have all the answers to all the questions that are in this guide, right?
You keep talking.
All right. So this is boot camp, which means we're not going to go hours and hours and hours talking about this, although we could because Genesis is a fantastic topic. This quarter has been written by Jacques Ducan, who teaches up at the seminary. He's an institution in and of himself in Seventh-day Adventist scholarship, and so we're excited to dive in here. There's a lot of great stuff in this lesson. So we're going to start with lesson number 1. You can see I've marked up my copy of it just a little bit here. The creation. Jim, why don't you go ahead and lead us off? What strikes you about this lesson this week? What do teachers need to know, or what should they know? Hit the highlights here.
Okay, so highlights. First of all, and you and I have already talked. I thought initially this whole lesson was going to be on creation. I was really excited. It is such an important topic. Now, Matthew, you know that I just took last weekend and went down and visited Ken Ham's Creation Museum and his Ark Experience. Mm-hmm. And there is so much there. There is so much fuel for thought that to have to deal with creation within the scope that we are allowed here was a little disappointing. I mean, this is a big topic.
It is.
I do appreciate that the author has taken us through the book of Genesis. I do like that. We've had a few lessons, just like Hebrews, where it was not in line with what the original author actually wrote, and so we never really got the thrust of Paul's message, that was there. But anyways, that said, there's a few things here. I made a few notes. Creation itself is big to Adventists. Maybe you're aware of the fact Adventists celebrate annually every 4th Sabbath of October is Creation Sabbath.
Yeah.
Were you aware of that?
Yeah, and that's a thing that's only popped up in the last few years, if I'm not mistaken.
That I'm not sure about. Mm-hmm. But I know it's there, and I know it's just part of our annual.
Yeah,
we need to be reminded. Okay, and that's not surprising. I mean, creation. I mean, it holds marriage. It holds a Sabbath. So I mean, it's important. Another thing is for some of our viewers, they might want to do a little Googling on a few people. George McCready Price. He was a big name in Adventism 100 years ago in terms of what he was doing and writing on creation, his views and such. He had, like anybody who kind of elevates towards the top in a topic, you always have your critics, and he eventually had his. Okay, I haven't heard any of your critics yet, Matthew, but one day I'll probably hear one.
Oh, so, you haven't been looking around enough.
And so you got George McCready Price, 100 years ago. A name that pops up these days, or at least I've seen a bit of, has been Tim Standish. Yeah. Something else for our viewers, we also have there is also a site called creation.com, and is a host of Seventh-day Adventists and others. But Tim Standish, who is just down the road here at Ames University, he's the associate professor of biology, or at least I think he's still there. So he's another name that you can also do some Googling. He's got some documents up on Google. And then I mentioned Ken Ham. Now, Ken Ham, I think it's safe to say he's a voice for evangelicals in terms of creation and the flood. So if you're looking for maybe something outside the Adventist box, take a little trip near Ohio, go just over the border into Kentucky, and you can visit that.
Yep. Yeah, you got that. And by the way, we mentioned that Jacques Ducan wrote this quarter's lesson. I mean, when we say he wrote it, of course, there's a committee involved that that always kind of re-engineers whatever the author wrote. So
yeah,
he's the principal contributor. He also wrote this. This is the new Seventh-day Adventist International Bible Commentary. This series is designed to replace the old Adventist Bible Commentary series. So this is the first volume on Genesis, came out in 2016. There has not been another volume since. They were all supposed to be out, I think, by now. But only one has come out. And so he wrote this one, too. It's beautiful. It's laid out really, really clearly, really, really well. So I know that you usually have like an author's study guide kind of thing to the quarterly, but this is really the author's study guide. I'm going to guess because these quarterlies are written so far in advance that they were probably written about the same time. So you find some overlapping things in here. But if you're a teacher, look at all those resources that Jim was pointing to, and I'd also recommend the Bible commentary too. If you just want that little extra, I shouldn't say little. How many pages is it? It's about 530 pages. You want a little bit. If you want a lot more firepower, here's where you want to go as well. And of course, there's other commentaries and other sources out there that you can consult. I tell you, you said, Jim, that you were kind of under the impression that creation was going to be the topic for the entire quarter, which would have been perfectly fine with me. It really would have, because I find it really hard. One of the things that really kind of got me about this lesson was at the bottom of Monday. It says, why does the idea of billions of years of evolution completely nullify the Genesis creation story? And then they give you one line to write your answer. There's a lot in here to unpack. There's a lot in here to unpack. One thing, just by way of background, that I want to kind of start us off with is Ducan mentions it here on Sunday, that the book of Genesis begins, in fact, with two different presentations of God. Now, he then starts talking about two different creation stories. I think this is something that is no surprise to those who maybe have had some normal theological training, the two creation stories in Genesis. But I think for a lot of members, that's going to be a little bit of some news, some breaking news for them. There's two creation stories in Genesis. What are you talking about, Ducan? Has he gone off the deep end? No, he's just reflecting where scholarship has been, I think, for a while. And that is seeing a separation from Genesis 1:1 all the way to chapter 2, verse 4a, like the first half of that verse, is seen as the first creation story. And then chapter 2, verse 4b, the second half of that verse, all the way to verse 25 is seen as the second creation story. You knew about that, right, Jim?
I'm supposed to.
Well, I mean, the issue isn't whether there's two creation stories. The issue is, what does that mean? Because obviously there's plenty of scholars out there who will say, well, this means that these two stories were written by two different authors, and they don't gel well together. They just kind of got mashed together by some later compiler. And Ducan doesn't go down that road. He says, no, they're two different styles. That's true, but they're designed to reflect two different points that the author of Genesis wants to make.
It's interesting because in recent years, and maybe recent is a little too recent, but critics of Scripture have risen over time. And, we might, as Seventh-day Adventists, we might talk about the book of Daniel, okay? The critics will say this was written by someone else other than Daniel. It's really not prophetic. It's written like 400 years later. The same thing happens with Genesis. So not only do you have evolutionists to deal with, but you also have those who come to the Scripture And they come up with a idea that maybe a lot of Adventists are not familiar with. Two separate stories here of creation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, unfortunately, the lessons don't give us enough time to really go into these subjects. It's just assumed that you're just going to agree and move on, okay?
Yep.
But the one thing I really did appreciate about Dukan in terms of approaching the two creation story was especially his emphasis on the name of God. So he points out that in the first creation story, you have God, who is distant and majestic and separate from creation. But in the second creation story, now we have another word, which is the one that we use for Lord, and so he brings God very close to man, which makes sense because in the second creation story, you actually have the relationship being spoken of there between the Lord and our first parents.
Yeah, absolutely. Two different, and of course the first story is a little bit more poetic. It follows this rhythm, right? In the evening, in the morning were, in the evening, morning were, and it was good. The second story is not poetry. It's more narrative. What happens, it's kind of like a zoomed in. You have like the wide shot in Genesis 1, and then it just kind of zooms into day 6 in Genesis chapter 2. So you get like what happened during the whole week. In the first chapter, you get what happened in day 6 when human beings are created. And of course, some people see contradictions there. They say, well, in Genesis 1, I think 26 or whatever, it says that human beings were created in his image, male and female, he created them. And then you get to Genesis 2, and it's, well, actually, Adam was created first, and then Eve. They weren't created at the same time. It was sequential. But, I don't think these are insurmountable things. I think they're relatively easy to explain why something like that might be there. It's just because he's zooming in now. And what looked like, two things that are really close together when you're zoomed out, when you zoom in, suddenly they're a little bit further apart than what you think in terms of the two creations of Adam and Eve. So anyways, it's just good to know these things. Don't want the teachers to be thrown off by where did this come from, this idea of two creations. It's there. It's a pretty widely accepted thing. The only kind of difference between different students of the Bible is whether that reflects two different authors with two different agendas, or whether it's one author using two different styles and two different sets of vocabulary in order to make a kind of give you two different perspectives on the same event.
Yeah, and maybe I'm a little too simplistic on this, but to me, it's just a beautiful picture of, in that second account there, the name of God switching over to the Lord, the relationship. You don't really have that relationship that comes through the first account. The first account is what it is. It's the beginning. Yeah. It's God. It's creation. But that second account gets right into that relationship that this creator has with his created beings.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you have the distance. What does he say? Dukan says it's majesty in Genesis 1 and something like intimacy in Genesis 2, right? So you get the two aspects of God.
Yeah.
The distance and the closeness, the transcendence and the immanence. Yeah, very good.
Whereas some people, it's just like creation in science, or I should say the biblical account in science. The critics will say, okay, the biblical account and science, they don't come together. They're two separate things. There's no unity. And I see the same thing happening with the two accounts. Rather than a lack of unity, I see a focus, and I see a focus that is actually to the benefit of humankind. Yeah.
Well put. Let's turn to Sunday here. This first question that we have in this whole quarter is about Psalm 100, verse 1-3. What is the human response to the God of creation? And I think this is important because Dukan, I don't know, sometimes I don't know if I read it in the lesson or I read it in the commentary, but Dukan makes the point that the author of Genesis doesn't have to begin with creation. He doesn't have to start with this story. We're here. We don't need to know where we came from. We know we're here. We know God rescued Israel out of Egypt. We know he was with Abraham, right? We know all of these things. We don't need to know where the sun came from and all these sort of things. And I think that's an interesting point because there's some ancient Near Eastern literature that doesn't begin with creation. Some of it does. There's some pretty well-known creation stories. So clearly, the Spirit who inspired the Bible thought us knowing this is important. So I think that's kind of like the first step in approaching this lesson. Creation matters because it's here, because it's in the Bible, because God thought it was important for us to understand this. Okay, we just kind of take it for granted that it's there. But as Dukan points out, that not every ancient Near Eastern kind of sacred text has a creation story. So it's good to appreciate that it is there and that means something, that it's important for us. Now, to this Psalm 100 thing, I think this is not a hard question. It mentions shouting praises to God, worshiping with joy, acknowledging Him as God because He made us. And the only thing I want to say about that is that this text, as does the fifth commandment later on in the Bible, it presupposes this basic ethical value that the ancient world shared, which was this: you owed honor to the person or people who gave life to you. Now, it seems like a duh thing to say, but it really is not. It's not necessarily common sense today. People don't walk around saying, my parents weren't perfect, but, I have to honor them. It's very easy. We have stories all the time of people who are like, forget my parents, they made decisions I didn't like, or maybe they weren't the best parents. I don't need them. This is not a culture today where we're honoring one's parents, or even, I didn't ask to be made. We say things like this. But back then, life was a gift. It was universally accepted as a gift. And it was universally understood that you owed honor to the source of that life, to your parents. Doesn't mean your parents were the best. It doesn't mean, if you had abusive parents, you need to stay in that situation. But you owed honor. And of course, if that was true of your parents, it's 100 times more true of God, who is the source of life. So this creation story, one of the reasons why it's important is it establishes God as the source of life. And in the ancient world, that just flicked on the light bulb for people, just automatically. Didn't even need to be said. Well, if God created all these things, then I owe Him what? Praise, worship, the acknowledgement that He is God, these sort of things that Psalm 100 talks about.
I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm struggling with this thought. Obviously, Adam and Eve did not have a really perfect picture of their parent. The serpent comes in, and I know we eventually come to the fall and such like that, but I mean, here's the serpent saying, you can't trust your parent. And
yeah.
faith in God goes by the wayside. We don't trust you. We don't think you're out for our good. So, as you're talking about how we will often find people kind of going back talking about their parents and their bad childhood. I mean, here's a couple people in a perfect environment, have everything they could possibly use, and man, I still don't trust the guy.
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely true. And I think that's kind of where everything unraveled, right? That's this original thought that entered into our heart, that maybe I don't need Him. Maybe I can have a more fulfilled life apart from my heavenly parent. And it turns out, how does Ellen White put that phrase with Eve? Like, by seeking to rise above her sphere, she fell far below it, that kind of thing. But you see with Noah, just a few chapters in the Genesis, right? With his sons, Noah gets drunk and passes out, right? One of his sons sees him naked and is cursed. And as dysfunctional as that whole story is, what was this son's sin? Is he dishonored his father by seeing him naked? It was not something a son should see or should do. Should have been more careful. But it was something I think anybody in the ancient world would have understood. Like, yeah, of course that's wrong. Today, it's just kind of like, well, that's a weird story. We don't necessarily draw the same lessons from these things.
And then, of course, with a lot of the ancient religions, you want to, do everything right for your God because you were afraid of your God.
Yeah.
So that's the other side.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that God has to tell the people at the beginning of the Ten Commandments, there better not be any other gods before me. Okay. And then you come to the fifth commandment. You need to honor your parents. And so, I mean, you do get this, you do pick up this line throughout the scriptures where it's told, you need to do this. You need to observe. You need to honor.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think the difference, I guess, between this God of creation and the other gods is that while I think it was generally accepted that the gods, you owed them worship, this God, this Yahweh God, places himself not just as a creator, but as a parent. He seems to love that metaphor throughout the Hebrew Bible, as being a father. This is why most people, when they pray today, say Heavenly Father or something like this. He loves that metaphor, uses it over and over and over again. He doesn't want to be known as just some distant creator. He wants to be known as somebody who created within relationship with the beings that he created.
And that's where I appreciate the second account of creation and so forth. I mean, all of a sudden you have a God who has been, stabbed in the back, okay, gone off after the serpent, trusting the serpent more. And yet this is the same God who then turns around and says, okay, tell you what, I'll come down, I'll meet you on your ground, I'll search you out. I mean, you wouldn't find that with another God.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Yeah, I mean, the other ancient Near Eastern literature just seems to delight in the power of the gods. And they just, did this. There's not a lot of intimacy in those stories. There's not a lot of personal, care that they care.
Oh,
in those
and a lot
stories.
of violence.
And a lot of violence. They just want to flex some muscles,
Yeah, and notice the difference here. I mean, we can talk about Gilgamesh epic and stuff like that. Those are pretty violent situations. But we also have violence in our own creation story, but the violence actually is one that's associated with sacrifice and a promise of redemption. So it's a violence on different terms altogether.
Yep. Absolutely true. Let's move over to Monday here, where we're talking about creation. And I'm going to put this question to you. Dukan asks us, what is the significance of the refrain, "It was good," in the first creation account? Cool.
I get that question?
Oh, yeah, you get that question. I got Psalm 100. I got the easy one.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you, I like the Psalm 100 one better. And here's one thing about Dukan, and I wanted to bring this out, kind of like early on. Dukan's name, for a lot of people, is not going to come up with Genesis. A lot of people are going to know Dukan for books like Daniel. He even wrote one on Revelation, which a lot of people thought was kind of out of his league until they started realizing, wow, he's bringing a lot of Hebrew background into Revelation, and it's there. So I just wanted to point out that one thing I like about Dukan is he takes, in fact, I even have a quote here from him, and he says that Genesis, and here's his quote, contains all the foundational biblical truths. Contains all of it. And so one thing I expect to find is that Psalms, he's going to find reference to creation. Daniel, he was my mentor when I was at the seminary, and it was amazing how much he brought out creation throughout the chapters of Daniel. Yeah, and likewise, we find our way to Revelation. All right, I got my little piece now about Psalms. I'll go on to the good. Okay.
Well, hold on. I just love how you had a good experience with Dukan when you were in seminary. I had Hebrew with him. It's the only class I took with him. And when I arrived late one day, just a couple minutes, he made me recite the Hebrew alphabet backwards. So obviously, we have very different relationships here with this man. But
all I can say is Dr. Merlin was far more merciful.
Yeah, well, I'll just say, and it was not good on that day for me.
Wow. So, good seems so... It's not the word that I would expect to find in the creation account.
Okay.
if my wife or one of my daughters was all dressed up for a special occasion, and they came into the living room and said, "How do I look?"
Hmm.
If I said, "Good," come on, Matthew, you're married and you have a daughter, okay?
Yeah.
I guess I'm looking for a stronger word than good. And fortunately, as we go further, we do find the words very good.
That's the best God does. Yeah, ours is a superlative age. It's like putting seasoning on food. I imagine how they seasoned food 100 years ago pales in comparison to how we season it too. Now, nothing can be just good. Good is not good enough, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's just I don't know. I think we just find ourselves reading through the account very quickly. We say, "Hey, here's what happened. It's good." We see what happens. It's good. It's just it's almost rote.
Yeah, it is. But I think maybe that you're highlighting here a barrier that we have as readers of Genesis to be understanding. This is not God just being basic or plain or unimaginative, like he's just creating and he's like, yeah, it's good. Like, good is good here. Good is good. And Dukan brings up three different meanings of the word good. He has it's functional. In other words, it's good in terms of the creation's working as I intended it to work. He brings up the aesthetic meaning of the word good, meaning it's good, like it's beautiful, which is, I think, the kind of good you're looking for there with your daughters. And he brings up the moral good, like it's good in terms of there's no evil in what I've made. So functional, aesthetic, and moral are these three different senses in which Dukan understands the word good here in Genesis 1, or at least in the first creation story is how I should say it. It's good. It works. It's beautiful. It's morally pure. It's a great kind of cradle for humanity to grow up in.
And you just highlighted what I always appreciated about Dukan in our classes. He does come with a Hebrew mind. He does come with a Hebrew richness to the text. The average person, for example, is not going to think of those three things that you've just mentioned. They just simply look at it was good. And, he's bringing out something far.
Right there. I put it in the margin.
And so that is the value of having a teacher. That is the value of having a commentary in addition to the text.
Yeah.
Now, I got to say this. Our people really lose a lot when they turn to the Sabbath School lesson, just read through the lesson, and never look at the text.
Mm-hmm.
Our Sabbath School lesson is not the scriptures.
Yeah. Well, we could go on this. I agree with you completely. I think, this is I think sometimes our fault as teachers is we're busy. And what happens is I crack this thing open here and I say, well, I think I know that text. It's John 3:16. I'm not even going to bother looking it up. I'm just going to write based on what I remember. Always take the occasion to look up a text. It doesn't matter if you have it memorized. Like, it's just lay eyes on it. Lay eyes on it. Just think about it for more than 1 second. Don't rush through this thing, no matter how busy you are. And just, go. It doesn't mean you got to look up. I mean, sometimes he gives us like a ton of text on one page. But I mean, the key text, at least, look those things up. And they are important to have in your mind.
Yeah, and
we don't
not only that, but these days we can open up the Sabbath School lesson online, which allows you to click on the text and it's right there in front of you. So, I mean, if turning pages seems like a long time, a lot of work.
If turning pages seems like too much work, then I probably shouldn't be teaching Sabbath School, okay? All right, Matthew out. I'm done. All right.
Exactly.
Oh man. So I think that's key. I think it's also important, just by the way, while we're giving pro tips here to Sabbath School teachers, it's good to when I did notes for this lesson to do this video, I started with what is the overall point of this week? Because sometimes we just look, okay, Monday's point is this, Tuesday's point is this, Wednesday's. You're not trying to, when you're done with I know you'll never make it to Friday, but when you're done with teaching your lesson, the goal isn't to give them 5 different points. The goal is there's 1 point. Sometimes the lesson makes that real easy. Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes you got to work a little bit here and trying to synthesize it together. The overall lesson I have for this week is that God's act of creation establishes the major themes of our faith. That is, everything you need to know about God is in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. And that's it. If I was teaching it, I would take that. Everything you need to know about God is in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. That's how important it is. And I would say a successful class at the very minimum is a class that understands that. And hopefully flesh that out, as much as possible. But that's my takeaway from it. That's my kind of bullet point of the entire week. And I think it's good to do that. Sorry, go ahead.
But I'm still wondering, why do we study the Sabbath on, Tuesday? And then we follow that up by studying the 6th day of humanity. I really don't know how that happened.
Well, it's very clear, Jim, because studies have shown that teachers will only ever get to Tuesday. Most teachers will only ever get to Tuesday. So we want to make sure they at least get the Sabbath in there. It's more important than human beings. Haven't you heard what Jesus said? Man was made for the Sabbath, not the Sabbath for man, right?
I can't recall if I told you, but I was a little surprised. Maybe I even sent you a picture, but I was a little surprised when I got down to the Creation Museum and found that the magnets that you can buy for your refrigerator only have days 1 through 6. There is no 7th day in that week.
Yeah, I think this is a lot of people say this. Well, it's like there's only actually 6 days of creation. Then there was the Sabbath. And I think Ducan's point here on Tuesday, really great segue, man. Ducan's point here on Tuesday is, yes, God didn't create on the 7th day, but the 7th day is a part of the overall creation week.
Well, what's the point of the rest?
Yeah. What's the point? Well, they would say that's what happened after. It's like, it's the weekend versus the week. You work throughout the week.
The rest is the response.
Yes.
And
that's part of it.
Not only that, but then we come to the 7th day, which is the only day that is actually marked as holy and blessed and purposely set apart. And we just kind of ignore all that.
Yeah. You're preaching to the preacher here. I hear you, man. I hear you. I think that this rhythm in Genesis 1 of the evening and the morning were the first day suggests there's these kind of 2 different components that make up the day. I would say in a broader sense, you have the work and you have the rest, and that's what makes up a complete unit. You have the day and the night. You work during the day, you rest during the night. That's one day. God works for these 6 days, he rests, that's that week, right? Which means no one ever gets Sundays off anymore, okay? Saturday is the only day of rest you get. God only took 1 day. I'm just kidding. But the creation week includes the Sabbath. That's Ducan's point. It's not 6 days of creation and then the Sabbath. It is the creation account, the creation week includes the Sabbath.
Well, apparently this rest is important because it comes up at the end of Isaiah that there is still a Sabbath in the future. And, we just got done studying Hebrews. That famous, 4th chapter of Hebrews. There remains a rest. Rest is important. Yes. Rest is the ideal. Yes. Rest is the promised land.
Yeah, well, and yes, and keep in mind, okay, we read this thing chronologically. We start with the creation story in Genesis. We end with the recreation in Revelation. That's kind of how we look at it. The people who read this, though, are people who came out of the Exodus. They understood the difference between work and rest. For them, work, their traumatic experience, work was what they were doing in Egypt. Rest was when God saved them and brought them out of Egypt. That's when they were able to rest, right? So for them, they would understand rest in all of its glorious tones of salvation, of rescue, of not being in slavery, right? Like, is rest being the opposite of slavery? And Ducan hints at all of this stuff on this day here in Tuesday. There's a lot of great stuff in here. He says things like, we can rest from our works just as God had rested from his. Sabbath keeping means saying yes to God's very good creation, which includes our physical bodies. Two more. The Sabbath, which marks the first end of human history, also is a sign of hope for suffering humankind and for the groaning of this world, right? That after all of this, at the end of all things, is a Sabbath rest. And then he says, the Sabbath is a sign at the end of our human week that the suffering and trials of this world will have an end as well. Man, why would you want to get rid of the Sabbath? That's great stuff. I mean, like I said, everything you need to know about God is in these 2 chapters. I mean, you see, yes, it's creation, it's first things, but you're also getting a hint of last things in here too, right? That at the end of our week as human beings is rest. And it's a rest that God provides.
And somebody might be asking the question, so why would Matthew invite Jim to participate when Jim's interest is Revelation and 4 horsemen and all that good stuff? Well, I shared with you before, when I think of Revelation, I think of that line. It comes from a movie, but I think of that line, Back to the Future. And to really appreciate Revelation, you have to appreciate the week of creation, because Revelation will be the undoing of creation, the 7 trumpets, the 7 plagues, the undoing of the week of creation in order to bring in the new earth, restore the tree of life, restore that face-to-face communication between God and man. I mean, it all goes together. Yeah,
it all goes together. So I think, to understand everything else that happens in the Bible, it is really critical to understand this. Why, because sometimes, you have people out there who don't believe in God who are like, well, God just seems like he just wants our worship, like he just demands it of us. He expects it of us. He does things to people in the Bible who don't worship him. Like, why can't people just choose what God they want to worship to? Is God against choice? Like, if you're so good, then why are you forcing people or punishing people who don't worship you? And it's like, no. You got to start here. Why does God expect worship from people? Because he created them. Because these other gods aren't real. And people are going up to Baal and going up to other people saying, oh, thank you, Baal, so much for this or that. And God's like, excuse me? You especially see this in Hosea chapter 2, where he's like, they made all these offerings to Baal with the olive oil and stuff. And he's like, but I'm the one who protected them and gave them the wheat harvest and all of these things. Like, I'm the one who gave them these things. Why are they giving credit over there? It's a matter of justice in that sense, that we give credit to where credit is due as human beings. And so we don't just get a choice of who we want to give credit to for what God has done for us anymore. Right. You have a choice when your wife gives you a present at Christmas to thank anybody you want to thank for it. Thank you, Matthew, for those bath oils you got me. I don't deserve those thanks, and I certainly didn't get you bath oil. So, it's incredibly important. Sabbath is then part of our way of thanking God. When we keep Sabbath, it is a way of recognizing God as creator. And when we don't keep Sabbath, we're not recognizing God as creator in this way. So we're supposed to follow in him. He works, he rests. We work, we rest. He's establishing a rhythm here in Genesis chapter 1 in this first creation story, a rhythm that we are meant to follow. Work, rest.
And, this might sound odd, but something tells me that Sabbath rest was also designed with in mind the eventual fall of man. I think of texts such as the lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world. So God knew ahead of time what was necessary for us, not only in a perfect garden, but what would be necessary and needed for us beyond the fall.
Yeah. Absolutely true. Do you have anything else on Sabbath? Or are we going to move back a day, talk about human beings?
Yeah, well, I'm glad we're following this in order. What would you this is going to be classic. What would you like to say about human beings, Matthew?
Yeah, right. I think maybe what he's doing, maybe my guess is he's trying to do this in order of the two creation stories. So Genesis 1 on Monday, and then of course you have the end of the first creation story on Tuesday, and then we go to the second creation story talking about the creation of human beings. He does bring us back to Genesis 1, of course. On Wednesday, he's inviting us to kind of compare the two human creation elements from the first and the second story. Genesis 1, 26 to 29, and Genesis 2, verse 7. What is the connection between the two different versions in regard to the creation of humanity? And they are different. Again, the first creation story, the human beings are created at the same time in the image of God. And it seems, it doesn't mention how they're created, but he creates everything else by speaking, right? In Genesis 2, 7, we see God forming with his own hands. And that's a huge difference, I think, between the two stories. This is not a distant God, as we've been saying. This is a God who's got his hands dirty in the mud, forming Adam and then Eve.
So I have two thoughts here off of Wednesday's lesson. I actually have more. I have heavier thoughts on Wednesday than Thursday. So I'll take the lead on this part since you got Psalms earlier. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I got the freebie.
So here's the first one. We just studied Hebrews, and we'll recall in the very first lines of Hebrews, I think it was verse 3 of chapter 1, we read that Christ was the express image of the Father. And we saw that the Greek word there was character, from which we get the word character.
Yep.
And throughout the scriptures, Christ identifies with us. I mean, almost perfectly. He's not totally man. He's still God. And so when I come down here to I don't know, about halfway through, and it's talking about the Hebrew words for image and likeness, I note here, we're Adventists. We got to bring in Ellen White at some point here. But
contractually obligated, in fact.
But anyways, here's her statement from the book Education, where she mentions that she says, when Adam came from the Creator's hand, he bore in his physical, his mental, and his spiritual nature a likeness to his maker. I mean, I cannot help but think back to Hebrews chapter 1, where it's talking about Christ being in the image of the Father. Here, we're also made in the image of our Maker. I see such a closeness at this point between what is created and the Creator. What is our brother who is in heaven? I couldn't bypass the fact that we have this word image coming up in both the last study and here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now here's one of the things that unfortunately we're not studying creation for a whole quarter, so I'll just throw this out. Okay.
We can just do whatever we want.
We'll just keep on coming back to it.
That's right.
That second to the last paragraph on Wednesday was so quick about the soul.
Okay.
Now, you've known me long enough that I like to pay attention to those things around us in other Christian faiths that we don't agree with based on the Bible. We just jump into this one paragraph so quickly about the living soul, and we moved right on. Yeah. I just want to remind a few folks that when Ellen White spoke about two last day greatest errors, one of them was the soul. And it's amazing to me that it was about 100 and some years ago that she was commenting about how this topic, the soul or the existence of the soul after death, how this was going to just continue to expand. I mean, Can you imagine taking that woman out of her day and seeing all the literature the movies, the television shows, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, today, the average Christian just simply assumes that the soul continues to go on. So I do appreciate, even though we hear it, often, I do appreciate the fact that Adventist ministers or Adventist evangelists will put an emphasis during their evangelistic meetings on how man became a living soul between the body and the breath of life from the divine.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I appreciate Ducan's emphasis here on the holistic nature of creation. Because theologians in the past have tended to kind of downplay everything other than what does it mean to be in the image of God, the Imago Dei? They say, well, it's just spiritual, right? Because God is spirit, so we just kind of have a spiritual connection to Him. And Ducan's like, no, like our whole being, physically, quoting Ellen White here, physically, mentally, spiritually, is a likeness to His Maker and her Maker, Ellen White says. And I think that's really critical to understand, especially because sometimes we downplay aspects of humanity. We downplay emotional nature, saying, well, we got to keep our emotions in check. That's the only thing. That's the only use for emotions, is to keep them under control. And we pay far more attention to the body as Adventists, although somewhat selectively, right? It's more like don't eat that and try to eat vegetarian stuff. Not a lot about exercise, not a lot about other things. But we pay more attention to the body. We pay more attention, of course, to spiritual things than we do to, say, our intellectual development or to our emotional development as well. But all of these things are created in the image of God. All of them were created to be good. We were designed with these features, and all are to be developed to be in continual harmony with Him.
I like it.
Now, we're not talking about women too much here in this. Poor Eve doesn't get a lot of billing in this quarterly. So if you're teaching this lesson, you want to bring some insights about Eve's creation up. I think that'd be good. Ducan mentions Eve at the bottom of Wednesday there, just one sentence. Just to kind of say, yeah, Eve is of the same nature as man, even though she was created slightly differently. You could really. And so, anyways, going to Thursday though, he says, as soon as God created the first man, He offered him 3 gifts: the Garden of Eden, food, and the woman. Very good. That's going to be a fun topic to bring up in class.
I was surprised he didn't mention the Sabbath as a gift. But then again, we've already talked about the Sabbath middle of the week, so I guess we're done talking about it.
Yeah, we're done talking Sabbath. Sabbath's over. Sun went down, man. We're in the second creation story. And the Sabbath isn't in the second creation story. Right? This is purely focused on human beings and their creation on that 6th day. Okay. So the lesson asks, what is man's duty toward creation and toward God? How do these two duties relate? It's pushing us toward Genesis 2:15-17, which basically just says that God put man in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it. Does that mean that Adam was created outside the Garden of Eden and then placed inside the Garden of Eden? Perhaps. Anyways, but Adam had a job to work in the Garden of Eden. Now, what does that mean in a perfect environment? Were there weeds? Is he grafting vines? Which, what does work look like in a pre-fallen world? It's hard to say, but it does tell us that work is good. We were created to work, not only to work, but we were created to work. Work is not a byproduct of the fall. Work is a good thing. We were given responsibility. God created all things, and then He says, you human beings, you just take care of it for me. Okay, so we understand a few cool things here. Number one is that God has given us responsibility over, and this is entirely by grace, because we don't have to create the world. He doesn't say, here's a barren planet, make something. He says, I'll do all the work. You just look after it for me. So that means all of our work is ultimately accountable to God. We are stewards in whatever it is that we do. Because even if you work in some tech industry or something in a cubicle somewhere, The materials that you're working with ultimately came from raw materials that were created by God. If you're working with matter, you're working with God. So whatever job it is that we do, we are all stewards of God. He has gifted us the things that we have. And I think it's in Deuteronomy, he tells the Israelites, don't get too proud of the things you're able to create and make, because I'm the one who gave you that ability to work. And so we have to recognize our work is an assignment from God, whatever that work is. And ultimately, we're accountable to him for our work and how well we take care of it. Then the second thing God tells them in this passage is, hey, you can eat from any tree in the garden, but don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for if you eat of it, you will certainly die. Kind of just emphasizing that you will surely die. Death will be the result if you do this. So tend to the garden and don't eat from this one tree. I wonder what kind of fruit was on that one tree. Because, I think I might handle the temptation differently. If it's an apple, like tradition tells us, I don't care. Is it a mango? It's a little harder, It's a little harder to resist that mango. Could be anything on there.
I'm going to send you a picture that I took down at the Creation Museum.
Okay.
It shows Eve handing fruit to Adam, or at least I believe that's happening because the serpent's head is in the background. But I'll let you look at it. You might even choose to post it here. But it looks it looks like a squid.
Looks like a squid.
I'll send you the picture.
The squid fruit.
Yeah,
we're gonna take a look at that.
Yeah, I looked at that and it was like, that's a squid. Yeah.
Okay.
So, anyways, I have nothing to add to the apple or the squid. Okay.
Okay.
But here's something just to throw this out there. Since we are talking about the garden and the tree and such, I'd like to just put a little plug in for our author Dukan, because you've heard me already say how he takes creation and he sees creation in the aspects of Daniel. And so, for example, when we come to Daniel and we're looking at King Nebuchadnezzar, who has the vision that he is this tree, and this tree is, covers the whole world, and all the birds come and all the animals come. And so that's just one example of how Dukan continues to extrapolate creation and the story of Creation Week out of Genesis and keeps seeing it throughout the book of Daniel. Just a little plug for those who may not have read his commentary on Daniel yet.
All right. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So we see these two duties. People often are like, well, why does God take away all my fun? And you realize he says here, you can eat of every tree except for one. But sometimes we're like toddlers and we're like, but this is the one I want. Why are you ruining all of my fun and you're taking away all my choice? And you're like, chill. You've still got 99 other trees around here, or who knows how many there were. It's just one that you can't eat from. But that's the one I want. It's the best. And it's like, you don't even know that. But you tell I have small kids at home.
Do you remember the name? Do you remember the name Irma Bombeck?
No.
Oh, she was a commentator, famous commentator back in the day in the news columns. But she could be quite the comedian. But Irma Bombeck was the one who had that famous line. In fact, I think she even wrote a book called "The Grass is Always Greener Over the Septic Tank." Well, that was that one tree. One tree.
Yeah.
Don't go there.
Yeah.
It's only going to result in death.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, here's something I'll just throw out. We will see in the next lesson when it talks about the fall of man, that one of the curses on Adam is that he's going to have to work the ground with the sweat.
Yeah.
And so maybe I'm being too simplistic again, but I tend to think of pre-fall work as simply activity.
Yeah, I mean, with purpose, right? He's not just
That's
throwing
right.
the ball around.
That's right.
Yeah.
But it's not a drudgery. I mean, it's because what do we see? We see pictures of Adam doing two things in most of the storybooks: either naming animals or laying in the grass with Eve.
Yeah. Yeah, there's usually like a tiger around, like a strategic palm frond covering, certain aspects of the human anatomy. Just that tiger or that bird is always in the right place at the right time.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, you're right. They weren't just lazy. Otherwise, I mean, even paradise can get boring if you don't have purpose. Paradise without purpose is hell. There's just at some point it will be. You get bored
yeah.
after a while. You go, sometimes people on deserted islands, after a while, like mentally, it takes a huge strain on them because they need connection, they need the reason for being, and it can be difficult. I think that it's important to understand that God introduces choice here. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is choice. Without it, Adam and Eve had no choice. There would be no awareness of other options other than God. So in order for them to truly be mature, free, moral agents, they had to have the ability to choose. Now, it's also important to recognize that God has the right to restrict access to this tree because he created all this stuff. This is his garden. And he's placed human beings in a position of management and says, look after this. You guys are stewards. And if I don't want you to go into this area of the garden, don't go there. And if I don't want you to, chop down trees, don't chop down trees. They're my trees. It's my garden. And I'm only going to restrict this one little thing from you. And I'm sure the tree didn't look bad. I'm sure it wasn't ugly and gnarly and had smoke coming out of it or something like that. I'm sure it looked like every other tree. But God has the right to restrict parts of his garden, just in the way that we as parents have the right to restrict our children from touching something. We try, at least.
And
or not going to play in the street.
Could the word restrict be too strong? I mean...
Yeah, he didn't... Yeah. He didn't restrict them like he forcibly prevented them from doing something.
Yeah, because restriction can almost come across as maybe a negative word.
Well, he did say that they would die if they...
No.
It's like, you're being too negative, God. Can you just tone it down a little bit?
There was a warning.
The consequences were... and we're not going to get into this because this is like riffing off creation theory, really, at this point. But it's like, what understanding would they have of the concept of death at this point? What kind of warning is that to beings that have never seen death? I mean, how do you even imagine what death is? Like, you stop moving? Well, you wake up, right? What does that even mean? But anyways, I want to get on to this third duty, and we can wrap this up. And Dukan says, third duty of man concerns the woman. Man, he quotes Genesis 2:24, man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. And he says, this extraordinary statement is a powerful expression that highlights human responsibility toward the conjugal covenant and the purpose of being one flesh, meaning one person. Well, let's go on just a little bit more in the lesson. It says, the reason it is the man and not the woman who should leave his parents. You ever wonder about that? May have to do with the biblical generic use of the masculine. Hence, perhaps the commandment applies to the woman too. Right? What he's saying here is, when the creation account talks about man, sometimes it really is talking about the male. Sometimes it's talking about humanity in general. That's the generic use of the masculine. When you say, what is man, that you are mindful of him, it means men and women, right? We all know that. Anyways, he says, either way, the bond of marriage, though a gift from God, entails human responsibility once the gift has been received, a responsibility that rests with both the man and the woman to fulfill it faithfully. Certainly there's responsibility enough to go around. I think it's definitely language that reflects the time in which it was written, when a woman would continue living with her parents until it's time to be married, and the man would come to her house, right, and make a deal with dad, make arrangements with dad, and then, he would go build a house for them, usually an add-on room into a pre-existing house, and then finally, so it was in the courtship rituals, it was always the man leaving his house to go get the woman at her house. And so this clearly, I think the language here in Genesis 2 probably reflects that that's the way things happened. Today, of course, people move out, they're single, they get an apartment or a house somewhere, men and women. It's a little bit different age of how our courtship rituals work out, how our independence works out. But I think the principle is still the same, that there's a responsibility to a marriage entails becoming one. However, whatever movement is involved there, it's a responsibility that rests on both parties to become one. And this marriage then ends up reflecting the Godhead itself, where you have three distinct beings in the Godhead who are one God. So in marriage, you have a man and a woman, and you have God, if you want to talk about God being in your relationship, who the three of them are united together, and they form one being. So really, Trinity, the Godhead, is the model of our marriage. This is what we're trying to achieve in our marriages. We're trying to be fused together into one. And that's the call that we have. It's a duty that we have, as Dukan puts it. That's kind of a strong word, but there it is.
Yeah, and I think of the Trinity too in terms of the husband, the wife, and God.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there you have it. I will repeat when I said I think everything you need to know about God in terms of understanding origins, destiny, morals, and meaning, you can find in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 in these two creation stories. If you want to find out more about Genesis, well, other than the fact that there's plenty of other Sabbath School places around the internet, you can also get a basic outline of Genesis from Bible Project. There's no point going through an outline of Genesis here. They did an excellent job on it here and trying to understand the kind of two parts of Genesis 1 to 11 and then 12 to 50. So you can go check out their YouTube for Bible Project. And there's plenty of more materials out there. I encourage you to get the International Bible Commentary volume on Genesis that Dukan wrote. It's very, very, very good. There's a lot more in here about the two creation stories, about the nature of covenants, about the authorship of Genesis. If we really want to get into that, and documentary hypothesis and all of that, it's in here. He talks about it. And anyways, Jim, thanks so much for joining me. We're going to see you in our next lesson. We're going to talk about the fall. I'm looking forward to that. And we're going to talk about the fall in the spring. So there you go. All right. Thanks so much.
Take care.